Extracting your wage. These are some of the ways that we describe the modern Western working experience. If you're listening outside a culture that's work first, yeah, you're right. It does sound horrible. But what are we going to do? Quit? My next guest is the assistant professor in management and organization at Pennsylvania State University, who has been studying the details and impacts of a phenomenon called micro-retirement. People treating breaks from work of 3 or more months as a sample of the good life instead of a scramble for the next thing. Today, we're going to explore how extended leaves of absence may just be what the doctor ordered and how the logistics play out as we ask the question, do we have to take retirement all at once? This is the Curious Introvert podcast with me, Meredith. Around here, we explore taboo questions and societal blind spots. My mission, and yours if you choose to accept it, is to inspire curiosity by exploring the nuance and paradox of our world. Please help me welcome the professor who works studying work, has her eye on both the past and the future of our work world, Dr. Kira Schabram. Thanks for being here.
Hello, thank you for having me. That was a fantastic summation of what I study. I may have to steal that.
You are more than welcome to. It's a topic that people think about a lot because I think a lot of people are experiencing that burnout feeling. But when we talk about the word micro-retirement, like I've kind of run this by a few friends in preparation for our discussion. I kind of get the reaction of like, oh, what a cute and inaccessible concept. So can we just start sharing examples of like real life people who have done this with success?
Yes, absolutely. So I will say that the term inaccessible in a way is correct, and we'll dig into that. As of right now, who we see taking these micro-retirements are people who are able to cobble together that time. That doesn't necessarily mean that they work in an organization that offers them a micro-retirement or sabbatical or paid time off. In fact, that's actually the minority. But it is usually people who have enough of a professional reputation or maybe have a house that they can rent out. They have some kind of resources that they are able to take extended time off from work. Briefly speaking, we find that people tend to fall into one of two camps. People either manage to take a successful micro-retirement after dreaming of it, often for a number of years, and thinking, here's what I'm going to eventually do. And then that usually entails a lot of travel or writing a novel they've always wanted written. Or we find that people get pushed into a micro-retirement because they have burnt out or they have left a toxic workplace, and the idea of immediately going into another form of work just seems untenable. So those seem to be the two ways that people enter micro-retirements that when we study them and talk to them, they report to us, it was a really great thing for me to ultimately happen.
I was reading on I think it was the New York Times article that you were quoted in, and because there were some real examples in there too about people who realized that the one was their father was on his deathbed, and they realized through reflecting in that moment and through his confessing, if you will, like, I should have spent more time with you and less time at work. That was like the catalyst for that woman's decision to retire early and spend time with her kids in place of getting another job. She was married, so she had that opportunity. But do you have any other real life examples that are top of mind?
Yeah, so really examples across the board. If you want to talk about what kind of working professionals, your point that a parent's death spurred a micro-retirement, that's actually a fairly common phenomenon that losing a loved one really makes us reconsider, what am I doing with my life? On a more positive note, we also see a lot of micro-retirements happening when people are thinking about starting a family or they have young kids. So often it's these personal life milestones, whether you're losing someone or you're bringing someone new into the world, that makes people reevaluate what should be the role of work in my life. And what we find is that that's usually not conscious. That's usually something they can only talk about after their micro-retirement. But what they find is that to really reflect on what do I want to do with my remaining time on this earth, if you want to put it that bluntly, usually only happens during that micro-retirement. It's that stepping off the treadmill that makes people really reevaluate what they want to do and what they're good at.
I mean, those are big questions. I think what's interesting to me is this new term a little bit. And the most cynical of my listeners may go, yeah, that sounds like something you make up so that when you're at Thanksgiving with your relatives, you have an intelligent way to explain being unemployed.
Yeah.
So,
So I'll give you my impression to that. Two
okay.
impressions to that. The first is they absolutely have made it up. And that really speaks to a society, especially in North America, where we don't have a term for that. A lot of the times when we ask people, well, why micro-retirement? Why not sabbatical? It's that they're rejecting sabbatical because they think that only applies to academics or that only applies if your organization's paying for it. So there seems to be this desperate need for us to have a word for this. And so they have grasped on micro-retirement, but when you talk to the people we speak to, we've got a long list of other words that they've considered. Some people call it the year of magical thinking or a micro-moon. We've heard all kinds of terms, but really it's a concept of why should I wait until I'm 65 plus to take a step away from work and reevaluate? And I should mention that most of the people taking these micro-retirements are actually extremely successful professionals. So people who've been on the treadmill in that rat race, often since before undergrad, highly accomplished students who then became highly accomplished employees. So the idea that they need an excuse at the Thanksgiving table, I don't think is necessarily true, but they are grasping for a word for it.
Well, and people who have those high performing careers, they tend to be the ones that are at most risk for burnout. But I also think about people in mission centered careers like nonprofits. They seem like they would be particularly vulnerable to burnout. But when I think about the idea of executive directors in nonprofits taking a micro retirement, I really can't get past the logistics of how that would work since most nonprofits are on a shoestring budget anyway.
Yeah. So if you don't mind, since you're talking about my other favorite topic, which is burnout, a quick side note there. We used to assume that burnout had to do with the amount of demands coming at you, that at some point it is overwhelming in terms of responsibility or work, and you hit burnout. And what we have started to narrow in on is actually burnout isn't so much about the volume as it is your feeling that I cannot handle that. And that's either because it's overwhelming, but more often it's because you're not being given the resources or the support to deal with it. So for example, if you've heard of the concept of compassion fatigue in more mission-driven jobs, passion fatigue is not that after a certain number of really terrible cases that you had to deal with, you hit burnout. It's feeling that you want to help and you can't. And so then now we're talking about micro-retirements as a solution. And you're saying, how could they possibly do that on a shoestring budget?
Well, yeah, because you used to work in nonprofit. And
That's
so my curiosity is like, okay, well, how would have your colleagues have felt if you were like, hey guys, you worked in animal welfare. You were like, hey guys, I know that, all these cats and dogs, they need help, but I'm going to go eat, pray, love for 3 months.
right.
So I'll see you in a little bit. Like, how would they have responded?
Yeah, no, very good question. In fact, I get contacted by a lot of nonprofits who are interested in this idea, and they ask that exact question. I'll give you a couple answers of how I think you can think about a micro-retirement or sabbatical, whatever you want to call it, as a really positive thing for those contexts. Number one, people in these mission-driven organizations often become overinvested and they really don't want to let go. And so having executives go on micro-retirements seems to be extremely valuable for training up the next generation of people. There's a lot of lower level employees who are very interested in rising the rank and getting into leadership positions, and they just don't get that opportunity. And so someone going on a micro-retirement gives them that opportunity. Number two, nonprofit social welfare organizations cannot compete on salary. This is a benefit that a lot of employees are craving and that you can do on a shoestring budget. So I think I am less resentful of you going eat, pray, loving for 6 months if I know then it's my turn to take my 6 months of doing that. You see a lot of nonprofits play with different models of giving more time off. So a very popular one is Friday afternoons off. And so a sabbatical or a micro-retirement really is just a version of that. Can we somehow compress time and use that to our advantage as a benefit that we can offer when other resources are not as available to us?
So, what would be the benefit to employers to offer this? Because I think an employer who's listening to this just thinks, oh my gosh, we're already struggling with employees showing up and, and doing their job and finding correct talent for these positions. they're really feeling resistant and adding in another
Yes.
benefit when they're like, people are not even doing the basic thing. But how would this benefit them if they were able to work past those logistical hurdles?
Yeah, absolutely. Which, by the way, I don't want to minimize those logistical hurdles. The rest of us will have to pick up that slack in some way while you are gone, though I will also say a lot of nonprofits have seasonal rhythms, and so you can actually time these things well. But assuming that there is a cost to this, and I fully understand it, let me offer you the benefits as an employer. The first benefit is that we find a lot of people who are taking a micro-retirement, as I mentioned earlier, have hit a wall. They are already being pushed into burnout. So what you are doing is you're avoiding weeks or even months and years of what we've now termed quiet quitting. Someone who's completely burned out, they're at the end of their rope, but they're not leaving. They're just sitting at that desk. Letting them take that micro-retirement gives you the opportunity to either have them re-energize and come back, or you're losing an employee that frankly you've already lost. They were just still in the workplace. The other benefit that we find is that we used to think people spend their sabbaticals, and again, we know a lot more about sabbaticals, but in essence, it's the same concept. But we used to treat sabbaticals as synonymous with vacations, and we find that they are very much not. People do dedicate some time during their micro-retirement to complete rest and respite. And that can be either half a day and then they work in the afternoon, or they might take, a month off and then really work. But that work bit is important. We find that people spend their micro-retirement working on things they usually don't, whether through pro bono work, volunteering, moonlighting so that they can afford the micro-retirement. And so they're building really job-relevant skills. We find that people who come back from micro-retirements often are promoted into either more leadership positions or into more challenging tasks fairly quickly after coming back, because in essence, they were training themselves on job-relevant skills while away from the workplace.
I've met people who, for example, at PayPal, they, from what I've read, still offer like a 2 or 3 week sabbatical paid. But when I read that, I was like, 2, 3 weeks? That's a vacation.
That's a vacation.
What are you
That's not a
talking about?
sabbatical.
Why would they call it a sabbatical? So I could see though in the American context where like half the people, I think it's 56% don't even use their paid vacation
Correct.
fully. It's really sad. I could see why a company would call that a sabbatical, or they would get away with calling it a sabbatical. But I don't know, what have those conversations been like for you? Because you're going into these organizations, right? And you get to poke around and ask questions. Tell me about those conversations.
Yeah. So with employers, you're absolutely right. We don't have a clear sense of what a micro-retirement is. In the same way that employers have had to make up a term for what is this thing that's not a vacation, I'm away from work, but I'm still doing work, and they've settled on micro-retirement, employers tend to call it a sabbatical. And so we find that 17% of employers in the US have sabbatical policies, but they vary drastically. Very few of them are paid time off, and even fewer of them are the amount of time off that in our research we find actually leads to this transformational change. For a micro-retirement to function as something that changes your perspective and your approach to work, we think at a minimum it needs to be 3 months, and 6 months to a year is much more common. So a lot of the times when an employer calls something a sabbatical or some sort of other term for that, it's a glorified vacation and few people actually take it. What we find is from an employee perspective, most of these micro-retirements are instead cobbled together because they had a coworker who found out that you could take unpaid time off and get COBRA benefits and then rent out your place and pay for it that way. So there's this weird point in time that we're at right now where employers are recognizing sabbaticals as an option, and a lot of them say that they're offering them, but what they're offering and what employees are looking for are very different things. Not sure if I actually answered your question there.
No, it's okay. No, you do a great job of giving me like the 10 mile up perspective. I think what I'd love to hear in addition to that is like the 10 inches up of perspective. Like what are people saying about that? Because I find it so confusing that we live in a culture where both people are burned out and people are not even taking their freaking vacation, where people are like tired of work and total corporate zombies in the elevator, on their 9 to 5. But also when I speak to people about like the vacations that my husband and I take, which usually are 2 weeks, a minimum. And we're talking about next year spending 3 or 4 weeks abroad.
Yeah.
And people are like, oh my God. And they have a disgust response. I don't
Yeah.
even know what I would do with myself. So I'm wondering if you could reiterate he
Yeah.
said, she said in these one-on-one conversations you're having, if it might shed a light on this high contrast phenomenon of having the burnout and the resistance to actually taking a break.
Sure, I'll give you a couple of answers to that I hope will triangulate, and you tell me if I'm still academics. We're up here at 10,000 feet, but let me
That's
do my
okay.
best. The first is most people who are burnt out don't recognize that they're burnt out. It's similar
Oh,
to other problems that, other people recognize, hey, you might have a problem. You just don't recognize it yourself. Ariana Huffington worked for years and years and years. One day passed out in her office, hit her head, had to take a break for up to 3 months. So the problem with burnout is we don't recognize burnout symptoms in ourselves. The average person experiencing burnout is going to continue to spiral down that burnout. That's the first problem. The second problem is we live in a culture in the US where overwork is at best glorified, and at worst, we have a cynical interpretation that we're not really supposed to take that time off. And you've seen that tension come more to the forefront in recent years with a lot of employers experimenting with unlimited time off. You think what employees
yes.
would take more. Employees and organizations with unlimited time off take less time off because suddenly there's this pressure to justify why you're doing it, and it's not worth it. I would rather just keep working and not rock the boat and not get in trouble. So that's a real problem in the US specifically. Around the world, we have people who do a much better job at feeling that it is their right to take time off, that work is just part of life. A common example I use with my students is that in the US, when you meet someone new, what you ask them is, what do you do for work? In France, people ask, where do you vacation? Right? It's a
What?
fundamentally different way of thinking about life, right? What is the purpose of work in your life? And last but not least, we're finding ourselves in a very complicated time post-pandemic. As a historian of work as well, one of the things I'm interested in is how our understanding of work has shifted in the long term. And what we have learned is that periods of pandemic change our view of work. So we are currently in a place where we've recognized that the old way hasn't worked, but we don't have an answer to what the new way should be because we are concerned that taking time off would be frowned upon. And instead of figuring out a more plausible way, we work harder and harder and harder for a lot of people until they hit a breaking point, and then they're pushed into that micro-retirement.
Okay, so as somebody who does study work culture, that's so interesting about France. That's going to live rent free in my head for a while. I may try that out. Like, hey, where do you? It sounds kind of pretentious, though.
It's a
I don't
rather
know.
privileged question in our country. It is not in France, right? Everybody takes time off and goes on vacation, regardless of where they are in the labor hierarchy.
Okay, so actually, let me pull that string for a second because the idea of a sabbatical, which we've mentioned several times, is not new.
Mm-mm.
But the idea of, a micro retirement is, but in Europe, they just call that August, right? Because everyone vacations in August. So if for like a whole month, it appears. So as someone who studies work culture, what would it take for us to get to that? Or is by its nature America so attached to the industrial revolution that
Yeah.
we can't adopt? It won't be possible for us to adopt a version of that European mindset and truly rest.
So a couple of answers to that is that I think it will be a lot harder to do that in the US. We have a very long history going back to the Protestant work ethic
Right.
that puts value in work, that imbues our worth as a person in the society in working. And in fact, there are some people who have written on this, often they're outsiders, people like Graebner, a sociologist who I'll digress for a second, but wrote a very influential book in the late 2010s called Bullshit Jobs, in which he argues that most of us hold a bullshit job, that our society has decided our worth comes from going to work and checking boxes or pressing buttons or doing these different roles during the day. And that's what we do without actually reflectively thinking of it. So I agree
Oh
with
my
you.
God, I love that. I may have to research this person to have him on the show.
Unfortunately, she passed away a couple of
Oh,
years ago.
dang. Okay.
I know you're 5 years too late, I'm afraid. But yes, I think he would have been a really interesting and entertaining guest. I highly recommend the book to people. But so my point is, I do think that it is going to be much harder to do in the US. On the other hand, I think there's a lot more potential because what you're describing in France is not a micro-retirement, it is a vacation. In France and in cultures where we see work and our private life as more distinct and where people are more inclined to work to live rather than live to work, there's also a bit more of a complacency that I am happy with my job, even if it isn't the most fulfilling or rewarding, because I get that month off. And so in the US, we seem much more concerned with how can I make my job better? And that has to do with questions of can I take more time off? But it's also about do I want to rise in the rank? Do I want to make my work better? Something that Amy Resniewski, who's now at Wharton, calls job crafting. Americans are much more interested in crafting their job rather than putting up with the 10, 11 months of work because then you get a vacation. So there is also an opportunity for us to really innovate around this idea. And then in this current time period with automation and AI, it just complicates everything. But we really have an opportunity here to think about what we want to do with work. If I may offer one more anecdote, John Maynard Keynes, who's probably still one of our most influential economists, in the 1930s predicted that by the 1970s, we really wouldn't have to work, that we would be able to outsource most work to, I don't think he would have anticipated AI, but some sort of automation, but that people would choose to work about 15 hours a week because it would give them meaning, it would give them purpose, it would give them something to accomplish. He was completely wrong about that. We work more hours than ever now. But my point is we've had this conversation for 100 years now, and there is something percolating about, well, what is the point of work? And what should I be doing when there are other entities, now AI, that can do a lot of the more meaningless labor?
You mentioned large corporations, work culture, and I think somehow in that there was an implication of the next generation.
Yes.
And I think about that a lot because I think about my observations. For example, someone I know who is in his 60s and works with a lot of people in their 20s and early 30s, he's commented to me these young people, they really just won't respond to email on the weekend. And they come in at 8 and they leave at 5. And if you text them, they just won't text you back. And I think he meant it in a truly curious way. He's like, I don't understand because I'm expected to answer my email over the weekend. I'm expected to answer my phone over the weekend. So my question is, from your research, what's your professional prediction? Will we have time for the pendulum to swing for young people who see work in a different way, rise up and be in charge? Or will they not rise up and be in charge because they don't think like that? They're thinking about what they're going to do on the weekend. They're not job crafting. They're not going, gosh, how can I become the executive director? They're just thinking, I'm going to switch jobs in 3 years because that's normal now.
So the big question you're really asking me is, are there generational differences and can we predict how people will approach their work in the long run? And so I'll give you a couple of answers to that as we see it right now. You are correct that when we look at Gen Z in particular, they tend to hold more of what we call a job orientation. The opposite of a job orientation we call a calling. And a calling doesn't necessarily have to be religious, but it's that you get meaningfulness out of work and you really over-dedicate yourself. A job orientation is, this is just a job, it is a means to an end, it is a paycheck. So we do find that objectively Gen Z seems to hold more of a job orientation. That's been a pretty drastic swing because in fact millennials were the generation that had the highest sense of meaningful work, of calling, of really overinvestment into the workplace. So we haven't seen a gradual shift, we're instead seeing this generational pendulum. There's one other very interesting thing about young people, and that is that when you ask them what they actually want out of work, their answers sound very similar to baby boomers. They sound very different from millennials and Gen X. They actually, in an ideal world, are looking for safety, stability, a long-term career. They would love the idea that basically has gone away in the US of staying with one workplace, dedicating themselves until retirement, and then getting the proverbial gold watch. The problem is they don't believe it exists anymore. So we have a generation that has become extremely cynical at a very early age because they would like exactly the kind of life that a boomer would say, why aren't they doing this? They would like that, but they have come to internalize that that doesn't exist anymore. And so why dedicate all this time and effort to chase a dream that doesn't exist? Then I might as well just treat it as a job. we don't actually see them job hopping that much. That again is more millennials. Gen Z is really trying to figure out what to do. And if an employer showed them some loyalty and showed that they're mutually invested, in academic terms, we call that a relational contract. If an employer demonstrates that you want the best for me, we want the best for you, let's rise together, Gen Z seems particularly open to that. And so policies that promote well-being, micro-retirements would be one of them. I think there's a massive hunger for that. Now, you also asked, what will that actually look like when they rise into leadership positions? That's hard for me to predict because we have this strong sense of cynicism, which also, by the way, is one of the symptoms of burnout, right? Are organizations or is our society in some way able to honestly engage with that cynicism and try to right that ship? If so, I think there's a real promise here that they are going to make the kinds of leaders that are both dedicated to their workplace and value their employees as not just a resource to make the work happen, but as valuable stakeholders. But if we don't engage with that cynicism, if we continue to see rising unemployment, if we continue to see what we've called a K-shaped recovery after COVID, with people either doing better than before or significantly worse, I don't see things getting really better. And then we're not talking about micro-retirement, we're just talking about people giving up. The number of young employees, especially men, who have given up on the idea of finding a career in the society has risen in recent years and is quite worrisome to me.
So, what about you personally? Because you are German, right?
I am.
And which is interesting because I grew up in the Midwest where there's a lot of German immigrant families.
Mhm.
So that Protestant work ethic, we brought that over. And it was very much tied to righteousness and, your worth as a human. And so, you have that presumably floating around inside of you. And then you are in the US and you're also in academia. So how do you view work and how do you view like burnout and breaks from work personally?
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, the idea of a Protestant work ethic comes directly out of Calvinism, which is the
Yeah.
idea that your worth comes from your work, was reintroduced by a German called Max Weber in the early 20th century. And the interesting thing is, in German, the word Beruf, job, is the same word as calling. So we treat the two as synonymous. Beruf, Berufung, it's the same thing. So we very much see work as this place in the world where you found your place, and this is how you can contribute value. I will say I see work in that light. So I am in no way cynical about work for myself. I feel so lucky to be able to work, to find a way to have meaning and purpose. And I would like for more people to have that. It worries me a lot that we used to think about privilege as having to do more with income and resources, that some people get paid better than others, even if, looking at teachers, really important jobs, that we underpay them. What I'm concerned about now is that we're even seeing a difference in terms of how meaningful you see your work, how intrinsically motivating, that we have given up on that on a lot of jobs. And so I come from this position of privilege where I fundamentally see the worth in work. Going back to John Maynard Keynes, I do think that if work magically went away, most of us would still see value in working for a couple of hours. There's something called the lottery studies that we've been running for 60 years, where you ask people, would you keep working if you won the lottery? And the numbers vary, but between 40 and 60% of people say yes. So I very much believe in that. And then through my research, I'm trying to find ways to make that more of a reality for more people. And that can be both in making the work itself more intrinsically motivating. We have a ton of research on what makes people get into a flow state or enjoy their work. But then I also think that in the US, we are primed for more work-life balance. And so these various ways that you can find ways to give people more time off so that their life becomes part of how they calculate what to do with their time, I think is really important.
It's so interesting to think of a micro-retirement as an asset to all of what you're saying and not a weakness. Because, as I kind of put myself in the shoes of someone
Mm-hmm.
considering a micro-retirement, I kind of think like, I don't know, like, okay, guys, yeah, I'm lost and I'm going to take this break to find myself, kind of going back to my eat, pray, love joke. But then on the other hand, you have this, like the FIRE community, financial independence, retire early. They do about the opposite, I would consider it. They work really, really hard to save and pay off all their debts so that they can live off the dividends of their investments and retire early. And so I'm wondering if like this again going back to this contrast, do you think that the shift towards the idea of taking part of your retirement early, like living off your investments for 6 months, taking it early while you're in good health, for example,
Mhm.
is a reflection of A, burnout, or B, the idea that, well, we don't know where our world will be in 5 years, so YOLO, might as well take it now.
I would argue neither. And earlier you asked me about what do you say to the aunt at the Thanksgiving table says, why
Yeah.
take a year off? If I may be so blunt, I'm getting a bit of the aunt vibes from you.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, I would say, why do we have to think of it as them being lost? For a lot of people, it's something that they have planned. I like my work. I like my coworkers. I've always wanted to travel Patagonia. I've always wanted to code this app. I've always wanted to see if I can write this novel. And so they're very deliberate about making time, planning that time off. And during that time off, they refresh. They also get that project done and they come back often to the same workplace and not just the same job, but then they rise in the ranks. So I wouldn't construe that as a lost perspective at all. Let's talk about the people who were pushed into it. So let's talk about that person who
Yes,
the
yes.
job was so toxic that they're now burnt out. I agree with you that they do not anticipate what will happen during the micro-retirement, but we found a very specific pattern. When those people get pushed into micro-retirement, they spend the first couple of weeks doing absolutely nothing, often just Netflix and binging, not getting out of bed, or if they're going to get out of bed, I'm going to go surf. From that period of time, they realize, wow, I was so burnt out, there needs to be something else. So then they decide to explore. Then they start to travel or they go to a yoga retreat and they get in touch with themselves. And it's from that exploration period that they go, oh, I could do something else. So then they often start practicing. They start a business, they work on a project, they volunteer. And so, yes, they started out as lost, but in fact, the micro-retirement, again, helps them find themselves. Now, in terms of future professional success, you somewhat painted it as a sunk cost, right? I'm going to spend a year away. I'm not going to earn that income, but YOLO, but I have no other choice. Even that's not true. Now, I don't know if this will hold if we are all able to take micro-retirements, but right now, because they are still rare, they seem to be highly valued by future employers. And specifically, what we find is that if you're someone who took a year off and you bicycled from Cape Town to Cairo, which is one of the persons in our study, in your future job interviews, they're really excited to talk to you about that. Wow, what an interesting thing. Tell me about that. Oh, you're a creative person. Oh, you learned adaptability. You figured it out. And so, if anything, it actually offers them skills where they come back into a higher income. Again, I don't know if that'll hold if we all do it. It might become a race of who had the coolest micro-retirement, right? But at the moment, employees think that's what's going to happen. So they think, okay, I'm taking a year off and it's going to cost me money, but YOLO. That isn't actually what happens. They get promoted afterwards. They get hired into cooler jobs. People are really excited to talk to someone who said, I'm taking a year off and I'm doing this cool thing. It's a skill.
Interesting. I really love that. So to course correct my anti-thinking,
Please.
it's like a micro retirement could be seen as reinforcement.
Yes.
Like I'm going to go reinforce my mental health, my skills and like take a course or learn something. I'm going to reinforce my relationship with nature. Love that you use the example of surfing. Go
True
ahead.
example from our data. We have a couple of servers. There's something else in there that was really paradoxical that we did not anticipate, but that comes from their data loud and clear. The people who learn the most from their micro-retirement, whether it was intentional, they had planned to take time off, or whether they were pushed in it from burnout, are the ones who a lot of the times had a really bad micro-retirement. So we find that having some sort of hardship happen to you, you are bicycling through Africa and you get malaria and you are down for a month and you don't know if you're going to make it. You're hiking in Patagonia and you break your legs. You are at an airport in Beijing and you get a phone call from your sister that your parent has passed. There was something about those hardships that made people seem to reflect even more about what do I want out of life? What do I want out of work? And come back more re-energized. And I just wanted to put that in perspective because I think in our conversation so far, I've painted micro-retirement as this really positive things. The other side of them is positive, but ironically, the ones that get the most out of it had some really bad luck during their micro-retirement. And I'd like to emphasize that to any listeners who are thinking about planning one, because what we find is that if you overplan your micro-retirement, great for you to work on your book, great for you to go on vacation, but you often come back the same person, ready to come back to the same job re-energized. It's the ones who seem to plan less, either because they were pushed into it or because, as you put it, they YOLO'd. They often run into a lot of problems because they didn't book a hotel and now they're stuck in Tibet and it's raining. And there was a lot of value that comes out of that. It changes them as a person.
So how do people plan for it at all? You
Yeah.
know, okay, there's under and over planning, but I'm wondering if you could address the what I call the yeah buts.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the person listening to this, they're like, okay, cool. Yeah, I really love this concept. Yeah, but how do I handle my bills? Yeah, but how do I handle the gap on the resume when
Yeah.
AI is filtering out things? You know, because once you're in the interview, yeah, Patagonia, bicycling, that sounds really cool. Let's talk about it. But how do you get there when employers are scanning
Mm-hmm.
the resumes and they see a gap and it's like, whoop, AI just booted you out. Your application isn't going to be seen. Like, how do you address the yeah buts?
I don't see it as a gap. So there's two answers to that. A, again, we assumed that a micro-retirement is just an extended version of a vacation. It is very much not. People do all kinds of stuff during their micro-retirement. Volunteer, moonlight, right? I've mentioned all of those already. That's what goes on your resume. It's not a gap. You were skill building, you were working on an app, you were doing all of these things. That's number one. Number two, we found that sabbaticals beget sabbaticals, micro-retirements beget micro-retirements. What I mean by that is almost every single person we have ever studied taking a micro-retirement heard about it from someone else, from a friend, from a coworker, from a therapist. And so they often copy whatever that other person did. Hey, this other person took this grant that our organization offers to take 6 months off to upskill this thing. I'd never even heard of that. Let me look into that. Or, hey, they did this freelance work with this organization and they can get me in. And so in a way, someone listening to this, unfortunately, I'm that person for you right now. Find someone else who's closer to you who's done one of these. I am almost certain they have, based on the prevalence we see now. Find that other person in your organization that has taken time off and how did they do it? Or a friend or family member. And then people, again, the people who have an organization says, here's paid time off, go take it. It's an extreme minority. Most people figure out how to do it and they get guidance from the last person who took one in their inner circle.
You didn't know that you did this, but that's kind of my favorite answer is to explore and ask questions of the people around you because each community is different and may provide different resources that, you know, someone on Reddit can't really provide.
Right.
That's
On the contrary, to the managers and leaders and organizational employers listening to this, I hope I've given you some food for thought about the advantages of this. Consider introducing these policies. It doesn't necessarily have to be a year of paid time off, right? Just making it easier for people to take that time off and maybe maintaining their health insurance. That's really a big hurdle for a lot of people. So there's opportunities here to use this as a benefit in your organization, especially if you are trying to compete for talent and don't necessarily have other resources to do it.
earlier you mentioned about 17% of employers offer something.
Something.
Something. If that number were bumped up to say, I don't know, 60%, 60, what would be the economic impact of that, do you think?
We're talking GDP now.
Well, sure. I mean,
Yeah.
you can answer that question in the way that your research best allows you
Yeah.
to, but I'm just trying to cover all my bases for people who are listening and just rolling their eyes.
Absolutely.
Like what a cute idea, but you know, we can't all do this. It's not possible for everyone. But I think these are the conversations that sit at the base of the mountain of cultural change, like exploring openly the yeah buts and the cynicisms.
Yes. I think it would be very much a net benefit. Let me talk you through the benefits. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it in numbers, but let me try. Number one, Gary Johns has dedicated his research career to studying something called presenteeism. When we're going to work, but we're not really working. We are zoomed out. Maybe we're wasting time on YouTube, or maybe we're just daydreaming. But that is a very common and costly phenomenon in the workplace, and it is particularly costly when people have no time off to look forward to. So as an employer, that's costing you money. Burnout has been added to the World Health Organization's inventory of diseases since 2019. So we recognize that in the US, we're spending, I don't want to make up the number because I can't think it off the top of my head, but it is a huge number in terms of healthcare costs for people who have become burned out. So that's an issue as well. The third thing is, and you alluded to it earlier, people are no longer staying with one organization. The average employee now switches jobs about 12 times across their careers, and that's across 4 to 5 industries on average. And the way they do that is by continuously learning new skills and expanding their perspective. Time off offers them that. Now, for an individual employer who may be losing an employee, that may not be the most advantageous proposition, although think about it also from the employee perspective of the new employees you're getting who've taken that time off on their own time for free to build more skills and to retrain. And then the final one that I mentioned before is that we found CEOs and higher level executives going on mini retirements were surprised by the potential it offered their organizations in terms of figuring out who would be the next generation rising into leadership. That as an organization, especially if you're a privately owned business or a family owned business, if you haven't really figured out how do we transition, a mini retirement is a great way for you to step away and everyone else to rise to the occasion. And then you're coming back and you have another couple of years where you figure it all out. So there's a lot of advantages. The net positive, I don't think I can put a number on it because I'm not an economist.
Right,
But
right.
but I would suspect that it would be really advantageous for our society to do this.
I'm definitely interested in just the mental health aspect alone. I feel like could be a net positive that, may not show up in a numbered way, but one that we can certainly all feel. So thank you so much for letting me explore this topic with you. Do you have any final thoughts before we sign off?
Yeah, since you mentioned well-being, I'll give you one final one that you just raised with me. When people are burnt out, when they crash off that cliff, one of the most costly things that happens to them is the energy that they have to expend to recover usually comes from other sources. And so what I mean specifically is if you're so burnt out that you now have to dedicate all your energy to recovering, you tend to burn bridges because you're not as responsive to other people. And so they think, why is this person ignoring me now? They were always so responsive. And so one other benefit to micro-retirement or mini retirement is stepping away. No one's judging you. No one's focusing on you. Out of sight, out of mind. So if you feel that you're crashing or you just need a break, stepping away, spending that time by yourself, no one's judging why you're gone, why you're eat, pray, loving. And when you come back, you're re-energized. You're not burning those bridges. So I see that as one other advantage that we hadn't talked about yet.
I love that. Thank you so much. This has been a really great conversation.
Thank you for having me.